Hi everyone. I hope you're all doing well. So what we're doing right now is we're transitioning from Unit 2 to Unit 3. And what we're going to be doing in Unit 3, this is probably going to be our trickiest unit for a couple of reasons, which is why I made it, I think, the longest, even though we're in such a short, condensed summer semester. And again, that's for two reasons. Number one, because I do teach Shakespeare for the comparative essay, and I'll explain why in a second. And number two, because comparative essays are seemingly very easy to write, but in practice, they're actually quite difficult. So what I encourage you to do is to really pay attention to the example essay that I have put on Blackboard for you all to read. And if you have any questions that you contact me, I'm happy to help you. Also, please pay careful attention to the feedback that I give you on your draft. I will be paying close attention to your organization, which is usually the trickiest part of writing a comparative essay. So what I want to do in this video essentially is talk to you guys about Shakespeare and his world and why we're reading As You Like It. You should have specifically this edition of As You Like It. If yours is slightly smaller than mine, that's okay, as long as it is the Folger edition of As You Like It. I chose this one very specifically for us because it's really helpful for students who are not particularly familiar with Shakespeare. I choose to teach Shakespeare for the comparative essay. In fact, every time I teach the comparative essay, I teach a Shakespeare play because I study the early modern period. That is my kind of literature time period. That is the period in which Shakespeare wrote. I've taught courses on Shakespeare, solely Shakespeare before, so I'm pretty familiar with him. I also tend to be a fan. I find him very silly and very dumb, but also very hilarious and very insightful. He kind of covers the whole spectrum of emotions for me. And I chose As You Like It because I had a couple of options whenever I was thinking about the theme of our course. I chose this one because I think you all will really enjoy it. I honestly do. It's very funny and very strange sometimes, and the ending kind of comes out of nowhere, and we can talk about that too. But it's an interesting play, and I don't think that it's one that a lot of you may have actually gotten a chance to read before, so it's something new too. But before we even go there, we kind of need to talk about the world and the context in which this play was written. So to that end, I actually have a PowerPoint for us. And so I'm going to go ahead, if I can get the technology to work, and I am going to share my screen. Well, let's see if I can get this to happen. Okay, yes, I can. There we go. Okay, so here is the PowerPoint. Obviously, I don't take Shakespeare particularly seriously. Yeah, the thing about Shakespeare is that we are often taught that he was some kind of like really highbrow, classy, super educated individual that was writing plays in the early modern period. That's not true. That's not true at all. Shakespeare actually came from, we would say, a lower middle class family. He didn't even have a title whenever he was born. He had to buy a title for his father after he had started making money from plays. And Shakespeare, going to see plays in the period in which Shakespeare was writing was not like a highbrow or high class thing. People of all different backgrounds and economic classes went to go see plays. So you would see like, nobility that hung around with royalty in the theaters, but you would also in the front, in the pit, and I'll show you what that means here in a minute, you would also see like people that lived in hovels essentially. So it was kind of a really popular form of entertainment, kind of in the same way that, although we can't do it right now, kind of in the same way that going to the movie theater for us is. It's something that people of all socioeconomic backgrounds go and do and enjoy. And it was kind of this really interesting mixture of different classes and types of people in the early modern period. And it should be noted that your entertainment choices in the early modern period were really limited. So you could go see a play, maybe a Shakespeare play, or you could go see a bear get baited by dogs. Like those were your options, kind of. Or you could go to the local witch burning. Like it wasn't, your options were limited. It wasn't considered a highbrow thing. Actually, it was considered really, really scandalous to even put on plays by the church. Super scandalous. Okay, so don't take Shakespeare too seriously. We often think of him now in our modern time as if he's like super great and everything, but he was just a butthead. I promise he was. He was a butthead. Okay, Shakespeare in context. So he's writing during what I call the early modern period. So there's a difference in terms here. Some people refer to it as the Renaissance. Scholars that have been working from the 80s since more commonly refer to that time period as the early modern period. And it really begins, the dates are kind of hard to pin down for it, but we're going to say that it begins in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The Battle of Bosworth Field, if you were a Game of Thrones fan, you might know what that is, or if you're like a history buff, essentially that was the end of the War of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York. So it's the end of the War of the Roses. Henry the Seventh takes the English throne. So the rightful monarchy is restored. And so we kind of locate it there from the end of that battle, Henry VII taking the English throne, because there had been decades of bloodshed before that at the end of the medieval period. And then we say that it ends approximately around 1680. That's kind of loosey-goosey. It's hard to know where this time period ends before it kind of bleeds into the Restoration, which is the next period after it. But that's an approximate. So you can see it covers like 200 years of writing, and Shakespeare is smack dab in the middle of that. The early modern period was really a time of drastic change too. I don't have it listed here, and we're not going to cover it extensively, but the entire idea of what a theater was changed a lot during this time period. Religion underwent an enormous change, and that is all because of Henry VIII and the fact that he just had to have 20 million wives in order to try to get a son, also because he was pissed at the Pope. This is a time of England really trying to build its empire. This is a time where the printing press was invented and people became more literate. People started to read more and to read for pleasure. That's wildly different than anything we had seen in the past, 100% different. And this is also a time in which science changed so much. So throughout the first half of the early modern period, we were really working still under medical paradigms that had existed since the days of Rome. Like, that's how long those kind of medical ideas stayed through. But then they started developing like telescopes and microscopes. And so science really, really, really changes, especially in the latter half of the early modern period. But during Shakespeare's lifetime, there were two key monarchs, and I want to talk about them. You've probably heard of this first one, Elizabeth I. Currently in England, the monarch is Elizabeth II, who is named for Elizabeth I. At least that's my understanding. She was born in 1533. She's the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And if you know your history of that time period, you know that Anne Boleyn actually is the woman that Henry VIII divorced Catherine of Aragon for, and partially why he split with the church. So Elizabeth I has this really complicated and kind of fraught parental background. And she ruled for a long time. She was the first real reigning female monarch in England. And she ruled from 1558 to 1603. And she was a very successful monarch because she played a very careful game. She crafted herself as the Virgin Queen. She never took a husband. She never had kids. I can't tell you for certain if she was ever intimate with anyone. We just don't know that. And so there was kind of this elaborate game that was played in her court where she was this virgin queen, kind of like Mary, Jesus's mother, but she was also like super beautiful and super sexualized. And so all of her courtiers were male, right? And they would all kind of, it's so hard to describe. There was this kind of elaborate game where they pretended that they were constantly trying to woo her and that they were romantically in love with her. And if you were Sir Walter Raleigh, you wrote her all this very silly poetry. Yeah, and she especially had a thing for her younger male courtiers, especially as she got into her 60s and onward. So it was this kind of elaborate game that she played with her male courtiers that allowed her to stay in power as a woman, and that kind of kept them in their place. Pretty much all literature was about her. One of the most famous texts from the period is Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queen, which she was known as a fairy queen, so is literally named after her, and there's multiple different figures for Elizabeth. They're all fantastic and beautiful and mysterious and virginal and blah, 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 blah. There was also, though, a lot of anxiety over a female monarch. So while the men of the country kind of accepted her rule because of how carefully she crafted her role as a queen, there was still a lot of anxiety because under patriarchy at that time, the idea was that man was head of the household. This reflected the state where you had a king, and this reflected, heaven where you had God. But now suddenly there was a woman who was a queen. Oh God, what do we do? So there was kind of this ongoing kind of anxiety about what it meant to have a female monarch and to be a man whenever you had a woman as a leader. Yeah, so whatever. Not too far off from our own times, honestly. I talked about her relationship with her courtiers. There was a struggle for her throne. So originally, Elizabeth had a brother who was younger than her that first inherited the throne. Then there was a cousin, and then there was Mary too, who was Elizabeth I's older sister. They all ended up dying, and so Elizabeth became the inheritor of the throne. Her reign, however, was fraught. I don't know if any of you guys ever saw the CW show, what was it called? Reign. That was about Mary, Queen of Scotland. So if you've seen that show or you know about it, what that show actually depicts, not always accurately, is the history of Queen Mary, and she was a contender for Elizabeth's throne, and so there were multiple plots during Elizabeth's reign to actually put Mary on the throne instead, because Elizabeth was a Protestant and Mary was a Catholic. And so again, that's kind of tied to the religious debates that were going on in the time period that we'll talk about a little bit later. This image that I've chosen for you guys is really interesting, this painting. So Elizabeth is the one here, all in gold, looking very regal with her head and her face high in the air, and you can see all her courtiers behind her. She's being escorted by a man. This is a really famous moment. So this is Sir Walter Raleigh, and he was one of her most famous courtiers. He was, how do you describe him? She was kind of really attached to him. They never had a romantic relationship like that, but he was an explorer for her, and part of building her empire and her navy. So he was really, really important. And here you can see there's kind of like a puddle of water, mud, and he's taken off his cloak and he's laying it on the ground at her feet so she can walk over it. And this is a famous scene which has been painted time and time and time and time and time again. Okay, so the ruler after Elizabeth died in 1603 was actually James I. And James is really interesting, not only because he was a man who was now on the throne, but because he was Scottish. So he ruled on the Scottish throne starting in 1567. So actually a little more than a decade after Elizabeth took the English throne. Um, and he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. So, because Elizabeth and Mary were also cousins. And so James was also her cousin, like her second cousin, I believe. And whenever he came to rule England, all of a sudden the whole kind of little island was brought together. So under James, Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland all became one nation, which we now know as the United Kingdom. And there was, again, a lot of anxiety over English identity with a Scottish monarch because James was primarily Scottish. So, what does it mean if I'm an Englishman and my monarch of England is Scottish? Oh, Lord, they freaked out. They freaked out quite a lot. And he ruled until 1625 when he died, and then his son, Charles I, took the throne. And then the English Civil War happened later on, but we don't need to worry about that. Let's talk about empire and navy very quickly. So there had long been a colony in Ireland, which is just to the west of England. It was started in the 12th century under Henry II, and it was renewed under Henry VIII, who declared himself, that should say King of Ireland, of England and Ireland. He just suddenly said, you know what? I'm the king of both, and I don't care. Bring the Irish to heel. Yeah, and what they did in Ireland, what the English did in Ireland for centuries was really bloody and gruesome. They were not nice, to put it lightly, which is why some of you may know that there are still ongoing tensions between England and Ireland to this day. So this caused big problems for both Elizabeth and James, who had to deal with a colony that didn't really want to be a part of England, and there were a lot of insurgents, and there was a lot of kind of, we would call it guerrilla warfare that was actually happening in Ireland. The Irish did not want English rule. They kept fighting back. They did keep getting defeated as well. There was also a Virginia plantation that was started, and Raleigh had kind of gone and actually helped with that. There was a lot of exploration and privateering at this time too, so this is when England kind of started to build up its navy and started to become a naval power as well. And so what Elizabeth would do is she would have privateers, and they were essentially glorified pirates. She would say, go bring me back some treasure and I will forgive any bloodiness that you do in the process. And there were some, like Sir Francis Drake, who were courtiers and who were really famous pirates and who went to court and hung out with Elizabeth. It was a really lucrative business at the time. This is also the time of the Spanish Armada, which occurred in the summer of 1588. The Spanish Armada has its roots in Henry VIII deciding to divorce Catherine of Aragon, which I already mentioned, because Catherine of Aragon was Spanish. The Spanish had never forgiven the English for what Henry did. And so whenever Elizabeth took the throne, there were a lot of tensions, especially because of the exploration that the English were doing, because the Spanish and the Portuguese saw themselves as the lead in terms of exploring and naval power. And then all of a sudden, the English were starting to build up their navy. And so the Spanish sent their fleet to the waters surrounding the south of England in the summer of 1588. And they were just destroyed, just completely annihilated by the English. The English ships were smaller, but they were super fast and they were familiar with the waters, of course, around the south of England. So they just absolutely decimated the Spanish. And this was a big deal for Elizabeth's reign, to be able to defeat what had been the naval power. Now England really established itself as the dominant force in the world. And it held that position for hundreds of years. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is also a time of great religious upheaval. So you have an ongoing debate during the period too. And again, it all goes back to Henry VIII of Catholicism versus Protestantism. So Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church in what is called the English Reformation in 1532. As I noted, this allowed him to divorce Catherine of Aragon because under Catholicism, divorce is a no-no, and marry Anne Boleyn instead, who is, of course, the mother of Elizabeth I. This wasn't just about, Henry's sexual needs, though. It was also about English nationalism and self-rule. So under Catholicism, all religion kind of deferred to the Pope, who was located in Italy, where the Vatican still is today. And so because it went, subjects, then king, then God, the Pope, who is supposed to be God's messenger on earth under Catholicism, could tell the King of England what to do. And Henry VIII was like, no, 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 no. You don't have anything to do with my nation. Therefore, I'm going to break up with you, Pope. So he did. And he determined that he was God's avatar on earth. This was a whole kind of upheaval. So the king became the ruler of the church instead of the Pope. And he essentially, what this elicited was a real defilement of all Catholic churches and relics in England. And it really elicited just like a 100-year period of extreme bloodshed as Catholics and Protestants really just kind of butted heads. This kind of came to a head under the brief yet remarkably violent rule of Henry VIII's daughter, Mary I. She ruled before her sister Elizabeth took the throne, right before, in fact. And she engaged in a lot of ritualized burnings of Protestants. So literally the authorities under Mary I would just round up Protestants. They'd get a big old stake, they would tie them all to it, and then you could just have a picnic. I'm not exaggerating. You could have a picnic and sit and watch the local Protestants be burned. Like, that's the kind of violence that this break with the Catholic Church really elicited, because Mary was a staunch Catholic, because her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was Spanish and a staunch Catholic. Elizabeth I, however, crafted her identity as her father's daughter. So she was like, I am a Protestant, but I'm going to be tolerant of Catholicism. So while there was still kind of punishments for Catholics during Elizabeth's reign and during the time that Shakespeare was writing and working, they weren't as extreme as in previous decades, thank God. And James I was also a Protestant. So after like two clear Protestant rulers, England had really established itself as a Protestant nation. And in fact, if any of you like have English background like I do, you may know that, so like generations back, my grandmother, who was raised Protestant, married an Italian, and often Italians are very, very Catholic. Oh my God, the scandal. So these two Christian religions still butt heads a lot today too. Let's talk about early modern theater, which is really, really cool. There were a number of early modern playhouses that you could go and visit. So what you would do is you would take, a coin with you, and you would go and you would pay a small fee to enter. And you could go to one of several theaters. They were known as the Theater, a very original name, the Rose, the Swan, the Curtain, and later, Shakespeare's Company's Theater, the Globe. There were different playing companies that competed with each other. So Shakespeare was part of the Lord Chamberlain's Men whenever Elizabeth was ruler. They weren't the Queen's Men, they were the Lord Chamberlain's Men. And then whenever James took the throne, they became the King's Men. And they were one of the most popular and sought after performance groups. And so these groups were usually made up of like set designers and stage managers and writers and also actors. And so someone like Shakespeare, he was primarily a writer of plays, but he did a little bit of acting too. He was also an actor. So their roles kind of blurred. So actors would also help to build the sets a little bit, what small set pieces there were, help to make the costumes, maybe even help to write sometimes. So it was really interesting. And these different playing companies also competed what were known as boys groups. So you could go and see plays performed by young boys too. They were really popular at the time period, especially in terms of singing voices, because their voices hadn't matured yet. There were no women on stage. all of the actors that you saw were male. So for female characters in As You Like It, whenever it was originally performed, it was all performed by men, usually by young men, like in their teens or early 20s, and they were made up to be women, and they put on women's clothing. This is really interesting in a period in which you had strict patriarchal rules which said, here's what a man is, and here's what a woman is. But on the theater, on the stage, women weren't allowed, so men had to be women. This brings up all kinds of questions about gender and gender performance and sexuality and desire and identity. And the English kind of were constantly grappling with this question of what makes a man, what makes a woman. So they did close the playhouses for moral corruption. The church kind of put pressure on the government to do that, and also due to plague in the late 1590s. As I noted, it was a wildly popular form of entertainment, and there was a real mixing of classes. And so there were also possibilities because, it was considered so raunchy and so immoral, and because you were having men cross-dressing essentially as women on the stage, you could do a lot of really interesting subversive critique of society and even of your monarch on the stage. And Shakespeare is someone who did engage in that. Okay, so this is an example of what an early modern playhouse would have looked like. In particular, this is the globe. And so you should note the structure of the playing house. So you have this kind of balcony area right up here, right? So if you guys have, and also down here, and if you guys have read or seen Romeo and Juliet, this is where Juliet would have been, right up here, while Romeo would have been located down here. There's a curtain upstage for reveal scenes, so you could suddenly draw back the curtain and gasp, there's the dead father. There's heavens, right? So this was imagined up here is the heavens. I assume you guys can see my cursor. I hope you can. And then there were 2 columns downstage. Those might stand for entrances, for buildings, for trees, for a statue or something. But the stage itself was really bare bones. You didn't really have a lot of stage decoration. What you see here is what you really got. And this part down here in front of the stage, that's kind of a wide open space, that is the pit, where usually the lower classes who didn't have a lot of money would pay, and that was just standing room only. And then you can see there's kind of tiered seating up around the side, and it wrapped around the whole theater. So that was where the more expensive seats were and where the nobility would typically sit. So there was still kind of a division of the classes in terms of where you sat, although there probably is in modern seating as well. We don't need to go there. What else did I want to mention on that account? Oh, pit seating. Being in the pit was really interesting. So usually whenever we go see a play today, the lights dim, right? And it's very quiet and it's very dark. It's considered impolite to speak during a play. That didn't roll in the early modern period. The people in the pit would yell at the actors on stage and be like, "You suck!" And then the actors would sometimes turn and be like, "Shut up, I'm doing my job." They would throw food back and forth at each other. It was kind of hilarious, actually. So there was this real ability for the audience to actually interact with the actors on stage and yell at them and stuff, and for the actors to be like, "Knock it the hell off," and to throw things back if they chose to. So some important facts about early modern theaters, as you may have noticed from this structure here, right, they're not actually enclosed up at the top. So all of the plays are staged in broad daylight. They happen at the day. You need that natural lighting to come in so everybody can actually see what is happening on the stage. Again, interactions between audiences and players were really common. There's very little scenery. There was a kind of pulley system, which is important to As You Like It, at the end of As You Like It, from the heavens that could lower characters onto the stage. They would just attach like a little hook to the back of a character's costume, and they could kind of raise or lower them. If you've ever been backstage and you've seen a theater, you might be familiar with those kind of pulley systems. We still actually use some of them today in theaters. There was also usually, although I don't think, oh, it does. Okay. There's a trap door often around about the middle of the stage 2, from which characters could rise or descend. And sometimes it was figured as hell, right? Or sometimes characters would just pop out of the ground. Okay, and let's talk in particular about As You Like It. So it's really kind of an interesting play. We would classify it today as, in the early modern period, it was classified as a comedy. And so the best way for you, I think, you guys to think about this is it's a kind of romantic comedy. It really fits in with that kind of genre. It is believed to have been written in 1599, so whenever the playhouses were closed, particularly due to the plague at that time. We're not sure when it was first performed, but it was probably at Wilton House in 1603, and it was first published in 1623. So whenever Shakespeare's plays were first performed, you couldn't usually get like an actual paper copy of it unless you were an actor who needed it to memorize your lines. Those plays were really only open to the public in the first time for reading material in 1623, which is after Shakespeare's death. There's some major themes and ideas I want to highlight. Sibling rivalry. You're going to see a bunch of sibling rivalry in this play. There's issues of power and leadership. Who is the rightful leader is something that is asked continuously in this play, and obviously that ties into questions over the legitimacy of who should be on the English throne in the period. There's a lot of cross-dressing and questions of what is gender. There is, the character of Rosalind. So Rosalind would have been played by a man, so he was already cross-dressing by playing Rosalind, but then the character of Rosalind cross-dresses herself and pretends to be a man. So you have a man pretending to be a woman who is then pretending to be a man. You can see how difficult the question of what is gender becomes in this play, which is something really fascinating. And because you have a man cross-dressing as a woman, cross-dressing as a man, it also brings up a lot of questions of queer and heteronormative love and desire, and we'll talk about those too. Okay, so let me stop the share. Okay, so you guys should just be able to see me, I think. So very quickly, one last thing before I let you all go. This copy of As You Like It. So at the very opening pages, you're going to see an editor's preface. You can get some more background about Shakespeare's As You Like It, actually from this edition. It's going to talk to you about how to read Shakespeare's Language. It'll give you more information about Shakespeare's life. You guys don't have to read that stuff, although if you're interested, you certainly can. The really important thing, however, that I want to show you is starting on page 3. So you'll see you'll have a full character list here. It's going to tell you who everybody is and how they are related to each other, and that's really, really useful. Keep returning to this character list in case you get confused, because as you can see, there's a decent number of characters in this play. And I know you're probably like, oh my god, that play is so long. No, it's not. So the play itself comprises that much of the book, which is most of the book. The rest of this is like notes and suggestions for further reading. But actually it's only half of this much. And that is because on any page that you go to, you're going to see let me think about this. On the right-hand side is the actual text of the play. On the left-hand side are notes that can help you understand what they're actually saying in case you are confused. Shakespeare's language is not Old English. We call it Shakespearean English, funnily enough. It's familiar enough to modern English that it's understandable, but there are certain terms or ideas which are a little bit foreign to modern readers. And so if you're like, what does that mean? Look on the left-hand side of the page, and there will likely be a note that will tell you, oh, here is what do him right means, which sounds very sexual to us, but just means give him his due in the early modern period. or what function is, which is a calling or occupation, right? Which is a little bit different from the way that we use function in our own language today. Something else that is also useful, if I can find an example for you guys, is, surely I've passed an example already. I'm just not looking hard enough. Let's just go to the beginning of the play. So for each new scene, so see, this is Act 1, and then it says Scene 1. For each new scene, first off, think of a scene as whenever you are watching TV, right? There's a whole kind of moment or section of time in that TV show before the screen turns black or switches to a different character's perspective. That's essentially what a scene is in early modern writing. But what is so nice about the Folger editions is that it gives you a little summary of what happens in each scene at the start of each new scene. And those are also located on the left-hand page. So it'll tell you that in Act 1, Scene 1, Orlando demands that his elder brother Oliver give him part of the money left behind by their father. So you know, oh, okay, generally that's what happens in this scene. So you don't have to worry too much about understanding overall what is happening. I hope that is useful for you guys. I am going to make a couple of more videos of me doing short readings from the play because it's also useful if you're reading Shakespeare to hear some of it out loud. Unfortunately, you all have to listen to me read it out loud. Usually I make students do that, but we don't have that option because we're an online class. If you have questions about Shakespeare or anything I've gone over, please feel free to contact me. I have a bunch of useless information about Shakespeare and the early modern period that you probably don't want to hear, but that I would be happy to share with you guys. And I hope you enjoy starting to read as you like it. I know I'm excited to read it too. All right, see you next time.